For months, entire cities had vanished, and nothing truly changed. Then, in August 1945, one city was destroyed in a completely different way, and almost no one realized it at first. What happened there seemed like just another chapter in a war that had already normalized the unthinkable. Reports spoke of total destruction. Leaders listened with skepticism, and the machinery of the state kept moving as if nothing decisive had occurred. Cities had been burning for a long time already, but something didn't add up. This time, there were no hundreds of bombers, no hours-long air raid, and yet everything was over in a single moment. Still, the reaction wasn't panic, it was delay. Why didn't a weapon capable of erasing an entire city end the war instantly? And how did a chain of political, military, and psychological shocks need to converge before denial finally collapsed? To understand the end of the war, we first have to understand why, at the very beginning, Hiroshima looked strangely familiar. By August 1945, Japan was a nation already accustomed to catastrophe. For months, American strategic bombing had systematically targeted urban centers across the home islands. Cities like Tokyo, Osaka, Yokohama, and dozens of others had suffered devastating firebombing raids that killed hundreds of thousands and left vast areas in ruins. From the perspective of Japan's leadership, large-scale destruction was no longer shocking. It was expected. Entire cities burning was no longer a sign of a decisive turning point, but a grim feature of daily reality. The firebombing of Tokyo in March 1945 alone had killed more people than would later die instantly at Hiroshima. Wooden neighborhoods vanished overnight. Civilians fled through firestorms, and government officials watched maps fill with blackened zones marking destroyed districts. By the summer, nearly every major Japanese city had been damaged, many of them beyond recognition. Against this backdrop, early reports describing Hiroshima as destroyed did not automatically signal something unprecedented. Destruction, by itself, was no longer informative. This normalization of devastation shaped how the Japanese high command processed information. When news from Hiroshima arrived incomplete and delayed, it fit neatly into an existing mental framework. Another city lost to bombing. The absence of hundreds of bombers in the sky did raise questions, but not immediate alarm. Japanese air defense systems had frequently failed to intercept small reconnaissance or lone bomber flights. A single aircraft slipping through defenses did not yet imply a revolutionary weapon. Strategically, Japan's leaders were still fixated on the future rather than the present. Their core plan, Ketsugo, centered on a decisive homeland battle against an expected Allied invasion. The goal was not victory in the conventional sense, but inflicting such catastrophic casualties that the United States would be forced to negotiate. This strategy depended on endurance, absorbing punishment while preserving the ability to fight one final, massive battle on Japanese soil. From that perspective, even the loss of another city did not automatically invalidate the plan. Underlying all of this was a deeply ingrained military culture that distrusted claims of miracle weapons. Japanese leaders valued sacrifice, resilience, and skepticism toward enemy propaganda. They had been told repeatedly that American morale was weak and that the enemy relied on technological intimidation rather than true fighting spirit. Claims that a single bomb had destroyed an entire city sounded less like reality and more like psychological warfare designed to break Japanese resolve. Thus, Hiroshima initially appeared familiar not because it was ordinary, but because Japan's leadership had been conditioned by months of relentless destruction to see even the annihilation of a city as survivable. Yet this fragile assumption concealed a fatal question, one that would soon force its way to the surface. If Hiroshima truly looked familiar at first glance, what happened when Japanese leaders tried to explain how a single bomb could do what hundreds of bombers had previously failed to achieve? In the first hours after Hiroshima was destroyed, the Japanese high command did not rush to conclusions. Instead, it slowed down. Early reports from the city were treated with caution, not urgency. Military officials questioned the reliability of eyewitness accounts and field communications, noting that similar exaggerations had accompanied earlier bombing raids. Without clear confirmation, Hiroshima's fate was initially categorized as another severe, but not decisive, air attack. When President Harry Truman announced that the United States had used an atomic bomb, disbelief hardened into institutional skepticism. Senior Army leaders rejected the claim outright, insisting that such a conclusion could only be reached after a formal scientific investigation. They argued that Japan's own nuclear research programs had demonstrated how extraordinarily difficult it was to produce sufficient fissionable material. From their perspective, the idea that the United States could deploy such a weapon operationally and at scale seemed implausible. This skepticism had immediate consequences. Rather than convening an emergency meeting of Japan's top decision-makers, military leaders delayed. The Supreme Council for the Direction of the War, the so-called Big Six, did not meet on August 6 or 7 to reassess Japan's position. The Army, in particular, resisted any rapid shift in policy based on what it viewed as unverified claims. Time was spent debating definitions, not decisions. Within the Navy, the reaction was more nuanced, but no less dangerous. Naval leaders conceded that the bomb might be atomic, yet they clung to a critical assumption. Even if the Americans had succeeded once, they could not possibly possess more than one such weapon. This belief was not rooted in optimism, but in technical logic drawn from Japan's own failed efforts. Producing an atomic bomb required enormous industrial capacity, something Japanese leaders believed the United States could not have mastered quickly or in quantity. This assumption shaped everything that followed. If Hiroshima represented a singular, non-repeatable event, then it did not fundamentally alter Japan's strategic position. The war could continue. The planned decisive battle under the Ketsugo strategy remained viable. Even catastrophic losses could be absorbed if they led to a negotiated peace rather than unconditional surrender. But as a result, the High Command treated Hiroshima less as a turning point and more as an anomaly, an outlier that required explanation rather than a signal demanding immediate action. The belief that the United States had exhausted its ultimate weapon bought Japan time. But it was time spent reinforcing denial rather than reassessing reality. That delay would soon prove fatal to Japan's remaining strategic assumptions. This disbelief bought time. But time for what? And what would happen if the assumption that the United States had only one atomic bomb turned out to be catastrophically wrong? Denial began to crack when physical evidence replaced speculation. Reconnaissance missions sent to Hiroshima returned with reports that defied every known bombing pattern. There was no clear ground zero caused by incendiaries, no trails of impact points from multiple bombs, no signs of a conventional air raid. Instead, investigators described a vast circular zone of destruction, with damage radiating outward from a single point. Entire districts were flattened in a way that did not resemble anything Japan had experienced before. These findings forced a reluctant reassessment. The scale of devastation could no longer be explained by firebombing, nor by the accidental detonation of stored munitions. The absence of unexploded ordnance, combined with the uniformity of destruction, pointed to something fundamentally different. Hiroshima was not simply another city destroyed. It was a city destroyed all at once. This realization did not immediately lead to surrender, but it shattered the argument that Hiroshima was merely an exaggerated report or a one-off anomaly. Under mounting pressure, the Supreme Council for the Direction of the War finally agreed to meet. Even then, the meeting was delayed until the morning of August 9th, 3 full days after Hiroshima was annihilated. The delay itself reflected the depth of institutional inertia. Evidence had accumulated, yet decisive action remained stalled by internal divisions and deeply entrenched assumptions about endurance and sacrifice. Within the Big Six, agreement remained elusive. Some leaders began to accept that the weapon used on Hiroshima represented a qualitative shift in warfare, one that Japan could not counter. Others, particularly within the military, continued to argue that even this new weapon did not eliminate Japan's capacity to fight. The belief that national survival required one final, decisive confrontation persisted, even as the strategic foundation for that belief eroded. Emotionally, the atmosphere shifted from skepticism to unease. The question was no longer whether Hiroshima was different, but what that difference meant. If the United States truly possessed a weapon capable of destroying cities with a single strike, then the logic of attrition, on which Japan's strategy depended, collapsed. Yet acknowledging that reality also meant confronting the unthinkable, unconditional surrender, and the possible end of the imperial system itself. Thus, even with confirmation in hand, Japan's leadership remained divided. Evidence had overridden denial, but it had not yet produced consensus. Hiroshima had exposed the fragility of Japan's strategic assumptions, but it had not, by itself, ended the war. Even now, with proof in hand, Japan still did not surrender. So what finally broke the deadlock? And why did Hiroshima alone fail to end the war? Hiroshima fractured Japan's strategic assumptions, but it did not destroy them. Within the high command, there was still room for interpretation, delay, and denial. That space vanished on August 8, 1945. On that day, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and launched a full-scale invasion of Japanese-controlled Manchuria. For months, Japanese leaders had clung to the belief that Moscow could serve as a diplomatic intermediary, helping secure a negotiated end to the war. That illusion collapsed instantly. Instead of mediation, Japan now faced a powerful new enemy attacking from the north, rendering its diplomatic strategy obsolete overnight. The Soviet invasion carried implications far beyond the battlefield. It shattered the last remaining political alternative to unconditional surrender. Japan's leadership now understood that the war could no longer be shaped through diplomacy or delayed through strategic endurance. The prospect of a divided occupation, or even the complete destruction of the imperial system, became suddenly real. What had been a theoretical fear became an imminent threat, accelerating anxiety within the inner leadership. Before the high command could fully absorb this shock, confirmation of their worst fear arrived. On August 9th, a second atomic bomb was dropped, this time on Nagasaki. The impact was decisive not merely because of the destruction itself, but because it destroyed the central assumption that had sustained Japan's post-Hiroshima denial, that the United States possessed only one atomic bomb. Hiroshima was no longer an isolated event. It was evidence of a new, repeatable capability that Japan had no means to counter. The psychological shift was immediate. Arguments rooted in technical skepticism and industrial limitations collapsed. The idea that Japan could endure further atomic attacks while preparing for a decisive homeland battle became indefensible. If one bomb could erase a city, and another could follow days later, then the logic of attrition no longer applied. Time, once seen as Japan's greatest weapon, had become its greatest vulnerability. Inside leadership discussions, the focus changed fundamentally. The debate was no longer about how to continue the war, but how to end it without total annihilation. Hiroshima had raised doubts. The Soviet invasion destroyed Japan's diplomatic escape route. Nagasaki eliminated the last technical excuses. Together, these events forced a convergence of political, military, and psychological pressures that the high command could no longer resist. Hiroshima alone exposed a new reality. But it was the combination of atomic repetition and geopolitical collapse that finally made denial impossible and pushed Japan toward the edge of surrender. Hiroshima did not immediately end the war because Japan's high command failed to understand what it represented. Conditioned by months of destruction, constrained by rigid institutions, and guided by assumptions shaped by their own limitations, Japan's leaders interpreted the unprecedented through familiar frameworks. This cognitive and organizational delay allowed denial to persist at the most critical moment. Hiroshima revealed not only the terrifying power of a new weapon, but also how human judgment, especially within hierarchical military systems, struggles to adapt when history changes faster than belief.